In the American political system, there are two separate yet equally important groups: the candidates who run for office and the FBI investigators who decide whether to prosecute them. These are their stories.
Tonight, a political noir starring person of interest, Hillary Clinton. I'm here in Charlotte, North Carolina, where Clinton and President Obama made their debut together on the campaign trail just a little while ago. Mark Halperin is about 160 miles away from me in Raleigh, North Carolina, where Donald J. Trump is holding a competing rally later tonight. We'll have Mark with us later in the show, but for now, I'm joined by my colleague Al Hunt in the Washington Bureau of Bloomberg. The context for both of these events today, the Obama-Clinton event and the Trump event, were completely and utterly changed, however, by the even bigger news that came out this morning. FBI Director James Comey announcing the end of his agency's months-long, high-stakes investigation into Clinton's handling of classified information at the State Department. In his public remarks at FBI headquarters, Comey offered a harsh, thoroughgoing critique of Clinton's email practices as Secretary of State, but ultimately recommended that no criminal charges be filed against the presumptive Democratic nominee.
110 emails in 52 email chains have been determined by the owning agency to contain classified information at the time they were sent or received. 8 of those chains contained information that was top secret. Although we did not find clear evidence that Secretary Clinton or her colleagues intended to violate laws governing the handling of classified information, there is evidence that they were extremely careless in their handling of very sensitive, highly classified information. Although there is evidence of potential violations of the statutes regarding the handling of classified information, our judgment is that no reasonable prosecutor would bring such a case. We are expressing to justice our view that no charges are appropriate in this case.
Even all the way down here in Charlotte, you could hear the collective sigh of relief from Clinton's Brooklyn headquarters, and the campaign put out a statement that said, in part, quote, "We are glad that this matter is now resolved," end quote. Republicans were predictably quick to jump all over Comey's decision, questioning the impartiality of the FBI's probe. Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, released a statement that read in part, quote, "While I respect the law enforcement professionals at the FBI, this announcement defies explanation. No one should be above the law," end quote. The chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Charles Grassley, is calling on the FBI to make all of its email evidence public. And Donald Trump, of course, turned to Twitter, first tweeting, quote, "FBI director said crooked Hillary compromised our national security. No charges. Wow. Hashtag rigged system." He also tweeted, quote, "The system is rigged. General Petraeus got in trouble for far less. Very, very unfair. As usual, bad judgment." Al, my friend, what happens now?
Well, Hillary Clinton has a second reason to utter a sigh of relief, if you will, John, and that is because the Republicans are playing this so stupidly. What James Comey said today is absolutely devastating. She was not only careless, she was reckless and arrogant in using this. But rather than seizing on that, they're trying to suggest there's something rigged here, there's something crooked. James Comey is a man of impeccable integrity. No one could question his judgment really on this. And I'm shocked at Paul Ryan. I'm not shocked at Donald Trump. What they ought to do is just seize what is out there. Because it is different than David Petraeus. Intent really matters here. David Petraeus, a man for whom I have a great deal of respect, gave classified information to his mistress. John, if that's not intent, I don't know what is. Hillary Clinton was just arrogant and reckless, and the GOP should be making that case.
Yeah, Al, I think that's right. Look, Director Comey clearly understood the politics of this, and you could see, rather than leading with the fact that he's not going to indict Hillary Clinton, he led with, as I said, a thoroughgoing critique of her, gave her political opponents a lot of material to work with and criticize her over. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot of it from now to Election Day, people citing Comey, people seizing on Comey. But the bottom line here, I have to say, you know, a number of people have asked me over the course of this day in Charlotte, well, how do you think this plays for Hillary Clinton? And talking to her senior staff here on the ground and having my own sense of this, this. This is a really simple story. The story here is binary. Indictment or no indictment. If Hillary Clinton was indicted, or Director Comey suggested that criminal charges should be brought against her, recommended that, this would be one of the worst days in Hillary Clinton's life. She might not be the Democratic nominee and might not be the President of the United States. As of today, a week after basically being exonerated in the Benghazi matter, today she has basically been exonerated in this email scandal, this email controversy. It is a good day for Hillary Clinton, and although there's going to be a lot of arguments going forward about what she did wrong, she is more or less politically now free and clear of this. There's been damage done, but she's free and clear. All right. Today is a day of dueling Tar Heel rallies in the state where I am in. Donald Trump holding one of his signature events down in Raleigh, while Clinton shared the stage, as I said a few moments ago, with President Obama, just a couple blocks from where I'm sitting. After giving a speech to the National Education Association Teachers Union in Washington this morning, Clinton boarded Air Force One and flew with her 2008 rival to a state that Obama won 8 years ago but lost narrowly in 2012. On stage at the Charlotte Convention Center, not far, as I say, from where I'm sitting at this moment, Obama took some jabs at Donald Trump while praising Clinton's experience. And, well, let's take a listen to a little bit of that sound.
This is my fight song. Take back my life song.
I don't know about you, but we are fired up and ready to go. Ready to win this election. Please join me in welcoming the President of the United States, Barack Obama.
Hillary! I have had a front row seat to her judgment and her toughness and her commitment to diplomacy. And I witnessed it in the Situation Room, where she argued in favor of the mission to get bin Laden. I saw how as a former senator from New York, she knew, she understood, because she had seen it, she had witnessed it, what this would mean for the thousands who had lost loved ones when the Twin Towers fell. This is not entertainment, this is real. This is not a reality show, this is reality. And being President of the United States means you have to deal with reality. But I'm here today because I believe in Hillary Clinton. And I want you to help elect her to be the next President of the United States of America. That's why I'm here.
Al, we are still waiting to see Donald Trump, so we can't do a side-by-side comparison of these two events, but we can talk about the Clinton-Obama event. So I was in the room, but you watched it, more importantly in some ways, on television, which is how most people were experiencing that event. So from your point of view there in Washington, how formidable do you think the Clinton-Obama tandem looked today?
Pretty darn formidable, John. You know, Bill Clinton really helped Barack Obama enormously in 2012 in Charlotte, North Carolina with that convention speech. And boy, was today payback plus some. Barack Obama, at a time when Hillary Clinton, you're right, it was a great day in the fact she escaped indictment, but her trust issue is a real problem with voters. Yep. Obama now is far more popular than either Clinton or Trump, for that matter. And I think he's got standing, and I think he did it today. He did it well today. It looked good. And I think North Carolina State, that I spent a lot of time in, I know Democrats who think that the one mistake Obama made in 12 was not contesting North Carolina. He might have won it again. And I think right now, if I had to bet, I'd put it, as of today, in the D category.
Well, I'll say, Al, this, you know, this is obviously a historic moment. I mean, a lot of Democrats have waited a long time, first having nominated an African-American and elected him president, and then now about to nominate the first woman ever to lead the Democratic Party, hoping to elect her president. To see the two of them on stage, former rivals, bitter rivals for a period of time in 2008, then partners in statecraft in the administration, now political allies. The crowd here was in love with what they saw on stage, and the Clinton people were in love with it too, not just because of the earlier news in the day, but seeing this on stage, knowing we're going to see a lot more of it, knowing how much President Obama wants to help Hillary Clinton, if for no other reason than to protect his legacy and also take on Donald Trump. And the fact that Obama is a convert to her cause, they think that's very powerful, that he was once a critic of hers, now as a convert. They think that is a big, powerful political plus that he can bring to this race, and they saw the first sign of it here today.
Well, John, I think you're right, but I'll bet you privately, at least among Bill and Hillary and some of the real Clinton loyalists, it must rankle a teeny bit, because they think that they are the great political strategist and everything of all times, and they need Obama. Obama is, you know, I'm not going to say he can carry him. I mean, that old thing about an Eisenhower jacket, there are no coattails. I don't think an outgoing president has much coattails, but he is a certain imprimatur that he put on today that I think is very important and very effective.
She needs the enthusiasm of Democrats, and Democrats love Barack Obama, and that is a huge political asset for her. All right, when we come back, we will get to more reactions to the FBI's announcement today from Team Trump and a Clinton supporter. That is coming up right after this. It was, of course, as we've just been discussing, a mega monster, gigantic, Godzilla-sized news day for Hillary Rodham Clinton. My friend Mark Halperin joins us now from the Trump rally in Raleigh, North Carolina. We're also joined up in New York by Clinton supporter and former Democratic Congressman Harold Ford Jr. and in our home studio, Republican strategist and senior advisor to the Trump campaign, Kellyanne Conway. Harold and Kellyanne, I'm going to start off with you guys. Harold Ford, I ask you this question. There's no doubt, as I said earlier in the show, that when the question is indictment versus non-indictment, Hillary Clinton's a big winner today. She didn't get indicted, and that's good for her. What do you see as the biggest political downsides to the way in which this was announced, the timing of how it was announced, and the things that Comey said in the process of exonerating her from any criminal charges?
Well, I think a lot of it's been said today. I would agree with your earlier characterization regarding the Clinton-Obama team, how formidable it looked. I think Al Hunt made the comment as well. And I would even comment, I think I saw Mark earlier in the day making the case that, to your question, John, that Mr. Comey, Director Comey, gave a lot of insight into what the thinking was around this. He talked about some of the things carelessness that he thought on the part of Secretary Clinton and some of her team. So there's no doubt some of that will be used. But I think a lot of this will erase itself, meaning the focus and the attention to this. As much as I think Mr. Trump and others may try to continue to gin it up, we've moved from it. Furthermore, I think the most important point is the one you made leading into this, or right before the commercial. If Barack Obama continues this kind of campaigning for Mrs. Clinton, for Secretary Clinton, and they're able to reassemble and reconstitute the coalition President Obama is that he was able to build in 2008 and strengthen in 2012, I think it's very, very difficult for Mr. Trump and his team, largely because the demographics of the country continue to move in favor of Democrats in many of these key states. And if that turnout level is as high as it was in 12, I think it bodes well for Mrs. Clinton. I didn't mean to cut you off, Mark.
That's right. Kellyanne, you're an attorney. You're new advisor at the Trump campaign. What is the Trump campaign's posture towards what Secretary Comey said?
Well, Mr. Trump will or has put out a statement, so he'll speak onto that. But I will say, whereas Comey refused to indict Hillary Clinton today, he certainly impugned her. And he apparently agrees with 67% of the country who says she's neither honest nor trustworthy. Mark, it's not as if they said, gee, I think I can't trust Hillary Clinton because she's under investigation for her private email server. Let's see what the FBI decides to do before I decide if I should continue to not trust her. Americans don't trust her because they believe she lies for a living. They see it as a fundamental character flaw. That will not go away anytime soon. And I would note, in their pep rally down in North Carolina today, neither President Obama nor Secretary Clinton did a victory lap on the Comey decision. They did not. She did not stand up and say, "I've been vindicated," because she has to be very careful. Director Comey's words were very harsh. He's not recommending indictment, but he said she was extremely careless. The statute says gross negligence, which I believe was met, and he says she and the people who were sending her emails and who were receiving her emails all should have known. You're talking about hundreds of emails. All should have known that this was wrong.
So Kellyanne, let me just stick with you. Why not just make that argument going forward? Is that the argument that you guys, that in the Trump campaign and others in the Republican Party, are going to make? Or are we going to hear from you, it's a conspiracy? Somehow Comey was in the bag with the Clinton campaign. Somehow this is all part of a, quote, rigged system, as Donald Trump likes to say.
Well, I think you'll hear all of that, John. And really, that's a large part of what this election is about. I think Mr. Trump got about 14 million votes in the primary, some of those crossover voters, for precisely that reason. The one thing that's not going to change between now and November is the insider-outsider, establishment, non-establishment election that has been set up between these two people. And the other thing that won't change is who is the insider and who is the outsider. So I think that in some ways this plays right into Mr. Trump's argument that it's a rigged, corrupt system that always benefits the insider somehow, some way. I think that Bill Clinton put his wife and Attorney General Lynch in a very bad position last week, so folks will go back to that. It wasn't like that was ancient history. It was last week. And I think finally, it's not going to erase the fact that people see her as corrupt. The Fox News poll last week showed 58% think that Hillary Clinton is corrupt. I don't remember pollsters asking the word corrupt as a presidential attribute when Hillary Clinton was not running.
Harold, if someone who did what Hillary Clinton is said to have done by James Comey applied for a job at the State Department or the Justice Department that required a security clearance, could they get it?
I would imagine so. I heard Mayor Giuliani, or heard that he made that comment. I'd have to take a look at the application in full, but I don't believe under the standard that Mr. Comey laid out, she didn't violate any statutes. He recommended to the FBI that the FBI recommended, to the Justice Department that no action be taken. He made the point that in terms of administrative steps that might be taken, sure. But
we got to go to break. But I just
answer the question is no.
We got to go to break. But I just want to clarify: if you were Attorney General and someone applied for a job with you in a senior position that involved national security, that would not disqualify them from your judgment.
We'd have to have we'd have a real serious conversation beforehand. But no, it wouldn't disqualify.
It is disqualifying. It's poor judgment, and it's a deal breaker, and it will be for many voters.
All right, Kellyanne Conway, Harold Ford Jr., stay with us. We'll pick up this conversation when we come back right after this break. We are back with Kellyanne Conway, senior advisor to the Trump campaign and former Democratic congressman and current Clinton supporter, Harold Ford Jr. Kellyanne, you watched, as you indicated earlier, the Clinton-Obama event today. Putting aside the questions of the FBI, did you see a politically potent tandem there on stage, or in some way, do you think they're deeply flawed?
Oh, I think today was a great day for Hillary Clinton. Her political career and her candidacy could have been over with an indictment. Instead, she got on Air Force One and went down to North Carolina. You and I paid for it, of course, and stood with the president. So it's a great day for any time you can have a two-term sitting president. Basically say to voters, elect her and give me the third term is potent. Ronald Reagan did it for his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, and it mattered. People really wanted the third term of Reagan. It's not clear that the whole country wants a third term of Barack Obama. But I have to say that when he was reading from the teleprompter, which was most of the time, I thought it was a great, solid, steady call for her to be the next president. And he was dissing Donald Trump because he can't help himself. But then I thought off script, the president went full-on partisan pundit. And I thought that was unfortunate. He's still the president of the United States. He's still the commander-in-chief. He has every right to endorse her and campaign with her. But I think there's a line that should not be crossed in terms of how political one becomes. I listened to garden variety pundits all day long insult Donald Trump, and they seem pretty petty and catty. So I would expect something a little bit different here.
In fairness, now, Mr. Trump has personally attacked the president over and over again and even continues. He's not put out the fire yet as whether or not he believes the president was born in the United States. That being said, and just another side, Mrs. Clinton paid her way on that trip today. I don't want to repeat what I said about the two of them together, but I thought it was a formidable piece. And if I were on the other side of this equation, the biggest worry I would have would be whether or not this group, the two of them, along with their many supporters, again, can reassemble and reconstitute that unbelievable coalition that Mr. President Obama put together 4 years ago now.
Kellyanne, the reason Donald Trump is here today is not a coincidence. He changed things up to come to basically try to step on the Obama-Clinton campaigning. Explain the logic of coming to the same state, and what's his message going to be tonight in the wake of Obama campaigning with Clinton and North Carolina?
Well, perhaps, Mark, one of the greatest assets of Donald Trump to the electorate has been that he is unapologetically unafraid of Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, and all the Clinton candidacy means. That's very refreshing, because we've had Republican nominees in the past that really pull their punches on any number of things. And so he's taken the case right to them. He's saying, I'm not ceding to you one of the swing states in North Carolina, the only one of the 9 swing states, may I add, that Mitt Romney bothered to win in 2012. So it is a marginal red-blue state, has a Republican governor and senators, but it could go either way. Barack Obama won it in 2008. But it also, I think he'll go out there and he'll make the case against Hillary Clinton. That's what I think. Today he can quote right from the Comey report, right from the Comey press conference. I think that the Trump campaign can run ads quoting Director Comey, where it literally says FBI Director Comey, and he's saying she's reckless, she was careless, but, quote, no reasonable prosecutor. So I think he's taken the case right to them, and he's telling North Carolinians, we'll be back here again and again and make this state competitive.
Harold, Hillary Clinton last week with Senator Warren, today with President Obama, later in the week with Vice President Biden. Is there any risk, we look at those people and say they're great surrogates for her, is there any risk that she starts to look a little uninspiring next to such a heavy-hitting lineup?
No, I just think it reinforces for voters and reinforces for the party and independents alike the wealth and diversity and strength of the party. Look, when you look at a President Clinton, Hillary Clinton in the White House with whomever she chooses as the VP and surrounds herself, as it was reported over the weekend, she might consider the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, and the CEO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg, to be a part of that team. You combine it with a formidable team in the U.S. Senate. I think it signals to the country that here's a president that can work with Congress, that can get things done. You've even heard Republican senators quietly and some even publicly say that they could work with her on foreign policy issues, economic policy issues. So, no, I think just the contrary. I think even today with President Obama, she opened with a lot of electricity, a lot of excitement, and a lot of substance. And they hear the president underscore how substantive and smart she is. I think only makes my point even more, amplifies the point more that she's not only ready, but ready to work with Congress in the process.
Today may be her best day, though, with President Obama on the trail, because, as you suggest, John, that maybe over time it won't wear as well, and she will be diminished under the far greater brighter star power of an Elizabeth Warren, and certainly a President Barack Obama. The other risk there is that we all know that cool is not transferable. And so her problems are likability and trustworthiness. You really just can't impute that to someone else. And I think he'll do her a great job at the convention, much like her husband Bill Clinton did for Barack Obama in 2012, most important speech in my view at the Democratic National Convention in Charlotte that year. So he will do that for her, but she runs the risk of looking like she needs to be propped up, that she just can't do this on her own.
Kellyanne, we've got less than 30 seconds. Before you joined the Trump campaign, you thought Tom Cotton was Donald Trump's best vice presidential choice. Do you still think that?
Oh, that was a parlor game with you on set one day. You said, say something nobody else has said. I think the best, I love the list. The short list is growing. Really serious, formidable people like Governor Mike Pence of Indiana, Senator Joni Ernst, obviously Newt Gingrich is still in the mix. And I think he's got a very strong list to choose from. And I like the fact that he's meeting with them one-on-one and being somewhat public about it, just being very honest about who is being considered. It also shows a unifying of the party that is often not mentioned fairly enough in the press.
Kellyanne, thanks very much. Kellyanne Conway, sorry to cut you off there. Harold Ford Jr., thanks a lot. Coming up, our takes on the vice presidential sweepstakes right after this. Welcome back. There are only a few days left to tinker with your 2016 Fantasy League presidential lineup and baseball lineup and all your Fantasy League lineups. And this is the final stretch of the Beepstakes season. So we're seeing some action from potential running mates. Let's start with the Democrats. A handful of Hillary Clinton's possible number twos were on the Sunday news shows this week, including Senators Sherrod Brown of Ohio and Cory Booker of New Jersey, and Labor Secretary Tom Perez. They were all dishing out Clinton talking points while dodging questions about whether they would join the ticket with Hillary Clinton. Mark, where do things stand at this moment with Hillary Clinton's running mate decision?
Well, I don't know who she's actually planning to pick, but I will say that I'm talking to Clinton people. About half the people I'm talking to are in touch with her about this, about half aren't. They're very happy with the choices. No one is going to make the case that her choices are going to revolutionize the race. The two names I hear the most from Clinton people who they're very happy with are Tom Perez, the Labor Secretary, and and Tim Kaine, the senator from Virginia. People seem genuinely happy with those. They'd be perfectly satisfied. And my sense is that they don't think she's headed towards a surprise pick, but the person she thinks is the best. And I still think she won't pick until Trump does, and that means maybe not until after his convention, since he may well pick on the eve of his convention.
Right. I think that's one of the key elements here is the question of timing. When does Trump pick? If it's true that Trump picks next week, as is being suggested, that'll give Clinton some time through the Republican convention and into the time frame when she'd announce, which would likely be on the Friday or Saturday after the Republican convention, to try to step on his headlines. You know, I hear those names too. Certainly I hear Tim Kaine a lot more than Tom Perez. Tom Perez, someone who seems to be maybe someone who they want to seem is in consideration rather than someone who's actually in consideration. I still think Tim Kaine is the front runner, and I still think Elizabeth Warren might be the best choice.
The other thing, Chuck Todd raised a name over the weekend, Tom Vilsack, Agriculture Secretary, former governor of Iowa. I thought early on that that's who she was going to pick. He fits, you know, I would say he's as exciting as Tim Kaine. He fits what she wants, I think, a governing partner, someone who people would say is qualified, someone she'd like to work with, someone who will be loyal to her. But I'm not hearing that necessarily as rising with a bullet.
Yeah, same here, and I think, you know, the main case for Tom Vilsack is that she really likes him a lot, and you can't discount how important that is, but it seems hard for me to believe that Vilsack will end up on the ticket, but maybe we'll be surprised by that. All right, turning now to the question of Donald J. Trump, billionaire and presumptive Republican nominee, at his New Jersey golf club this holiday weekend. Trump met with two possible running mates who until recently have not been widely speculated about. That would be Indiana Governor Mike Pence, who huddled with Trump on Saturday, and Iowa Senator Joni Ernst, who had her face-to-face meeting with Trump on Monday. Tomorrow, we have Newt Gingrich reportedly campaigning with the Donald in Cincinnati. And, of course, tonight, where you are, Mark, you've got Senator Bob Corker from Tennessee. So the same question I asked you before applies now on the Republican side. Where does Trump's running mate decision stand in your mind?
Well, look, one of the funniest things I've ever heard someone from a campaign say about beef steaks was Kellyanne Conway, who just said in the last segment, the short list is getting longer, and acted as if that's a good thing. It's very similar, I think, to what happened with John McCain. Down to a handful of choices, and then saying, you know what? These choices may not be good enough. Expanding to Pence, expanding to Joni Ernst, and I believe a number of aides, the new aides who've come in the last few weeks since Corey Lewandowski left and around that time, looked at the list that Trump was honing in on and said, no one on that list is actually right. You need to think anew and think more broadly. And I think, although I doubted he and Pence would hit it off, it sounds from their accounts of the meeting that maybe they did, and I think Pence makes a lot of sense considering the other alternatives.
Well, he's got to solve the problem that he has right now, the big problem he has, which is getting the Republican base, Republicans to come home, and Pence might be as good a solution on that front as any solution. I think that's the best argument now against putting Chris Christie on the ticket, someone who I think temperamentally Trump is really attracted to. But Christie doesn't solve the problem of getting Republicans to come home to Donald Trump. So maybe Christie's starting to fade from view. I know the Clinton people, some of whom I talked to just today here in Charlotte, they still think Trump will go with his gut in the end. Now, they don't know anything about what's going on internally, but they all suspect in the end that it'll be Christie or Gingrich. But they obviously could be wrong. Democrats don't know very much about Republicans in general and about Trump in particular.
Yeah, I don't know this for a fact, but I have one source suggesting to me that he's been talked out of Gingrich, that they'll find another role for Gingrich in the administration, and that may well be a dead letter. But everybody says, in the end, this is Trump's decision. Trump may just go with this gut, and that could mean anybody. And I don't envy A.B. Culverhouse, the vetting lawyer, and the young lawyers and older lawyers working with him, because they are under pressure now, just like with Palin, to vet somebody in a big hurry under time pressure.
Let's remember, that's exactly what happened to Culverhouse 8 years ago, and he might have to go through it all over again. All right, it was another rocky weekend for Trump. You'd think that Hillary Clinton's interview at the FBI headquarters would have dominated the 4th of July holiday long weekend. Instead, we were all talking about that tweet that the Trump campaign sent out with what seemed to be, to almost everyone, an image of the Star of David. Some said, to the contrary, it might be a sheriff's badge. In case your barbecue grill didn't give you any news updates this weekend, here's a quick refresher.
Donald Trump, star of David, here's what happened. Saturday, Trump tweets image of Hillary Clinton, a pile of money, and a red star.
Many people would say that resembles the Star of David.
It's immediately called anti-Semitic. Its origins investigated.
The image previously posted on a white supremacist message board.
Then it's deleted. Then it's replaced by an image of Hillary Clinton, a pile of money, and a circle. But wait, that circle. Enhance. Enhance.
The points of the star were still visible.
The pile-on continues.
A firestorm of controversy.
On Monday, Trump tweets that it was a sheriff's star. Twitter responds, then why did you delete it if it wasn't an issue? Clinton's campaign calls it blatantly anti-Semitic. Trump's campaign says Clinton is trying to divert attention from her issues. Trump's guys debate shapes.
Not every six-sided star is a Star of David.
This is a simple star.
This hand-wringing that's going on over a geometric shape in a tweet is really out of hand.
Geometric shape, it's the Star of David over $100 bills. This is not geometry we're talking about here. It's imagery, which is significant to a lot of people, Michael.
On to the next story.
And it's hurtful to a lot of people. But I do want to take at least a minute to play Veepstakes with you.
So, Mark, given the momentous Clinton news dropped by Director Comey today, is this Trump tweet controversy over, basically, or will it linger somehow?
I think it's over because of the Comey news and because Veepstakes and the conventions are coming. But I do think that once again, Trump has got to prove himself and his operation prove himself to Republicans. He can't let a story like this fester. Whatever you think, whether you think it's unfair, whether you think the press is out to get you, whatever, you just can't let a story like this fester. So I think he's off the hook probably for this one in terms of dominating the news. But he does have to prove himself that he won't let these kind of things happen. Doesn't have a day to waste.
This is not the first time that Donald Trump has tweeted things that have their origins in the nastiest, most disgusting corners of the alt-right universe in Twitter. It's like the sixth time where some image that Trump has tweeted has been sourced to some white nationalist, white supremacist, anti-Semitic, racist Twitter account. He's got to cut it out. He's got to stop it, because if he keeps doing it, people are going to come to the conclusion that he's playing with fire, that he's trying to rile up parts of the Republican base that are the ugliest parts of it. And if Trump doesn't want that impression, he can cut it out. He just needs to stop.
And even if it was an absolute accident, a total coincidence, even if, he still should take the opportunity to apologize, to be indignant not about Hillary Clinton in this case, or the press,
right,
but to be indignant about the groups who he's being associated with. And that lack of indignation is hurting him with Republicans as well as Democrats. There's no doubt in my mind.
100%. The Anti-Defamation League said something that was completely true about this. They said Donald Trump has had no problem denouncing people he disagrees with in the most clear and unequivocal terms. He's denounced a lot of them. He should be denouncing these kinds of people and these kinds of websites and Twitter accounts with the same kind of clarity. All right, coming up, our good friend Al Hunt comes back on the show and weighs in on why he says the FBI was right to not recommend criminal charges against Hillary Clinton. That is next. We're joined again from Washington by Bloomberg View columnist and our great friend Albert Hunt. Mr. Hunt wrote a column today entitled "Hillary Clinton Needs a Dr. No." Al, as I read your column today, brilliant as always, it said Comey made the right decision, but Hillary Clinton needs some help. What kind of help does Hillary Clinton need?
She needs someone to say, Mrs. Clinton or Madam President or Madam Secretary, you can't do this. She shouldn't have done the email server. Someone should have told her that back in 2009. Someone should have told her, John, I'm sorry, fine if you want to give speeches, but you're a very rich person. Don't take $275 grand from Goldman Sachs. Someone should have told Bill Clinton, don't go on that airplane with Loretta Lynch. You know, the Clintons have a lot of talents, and I think in a time of crisis, you'd feel pretty good about Hillary Clinton. But they also have a sense of entitlement and arrogance. We're somehow good people, so the same rules don't apply to us. She needs someone to tell her from now on, no, that's not right.
Al, in the context of going forward, why shouldn't that person be someone you know well, John Podesta, who seems to have no problem?
Well, I think John Podesta is the one who best qualifies for it. He wasn't at the State Department, but, you know, kind of a cautionary flag there, Mark, which I wrote about in that column today. John Podesta left the White House in the early morning of January 20th, 2001, convinced that he had persuaded Bill Clinton, don't pardon Mark Rich, a really sleazy fugitive. And poor John got back a couple hours later after a few hours of sleep and found out Clinton had pardoned Mark Rich. So it's not an easy task.
Al, in Hillary Clinton's operation of this campaign now, is it possible to put someone in that role? How would it actually be enacted?
Well, I think I'm thinking more of a presidency if she should win, Mark. John Podesta is an adult. I think he can do that in the campaign. These other incidents occurred before the campaign. I think she's made some mistakes, but nothing quite of that egregious nature. But when she gets to be president, right, she's got a lot of smart people around her, but most of them tend to be real Hillary loyalists. And it's not that you want people around you who aren't loyal. You want someone around you who, as I said, will say no. You know, I was corresponding with our mutual friend Bob Shrum today, who said Ted Kennedy one time said that President Kennedy said to him, you got to have 2 or 3 sons of bitches around you who'll say you can't do that, and then you have to reward them and let them know that that's what you need. That's what she needs.
Al, I'm apparently a very lucky man because I have way more than 2 or 3 sons of bitches around me at all times. My question for you, Al, is, you know, you're talking about the Dr. No that she needs. Right now, she's recruiting a Dr. Yes. We talked about the beep steaks earlier. Who do you think makes sense for Hillary as her running mate?
Well, I don't think Tom Perez does. I don't think the idea of an unelected person should ever be a running mate, as good a labor secretary as he might be. I think the one that makes the most sense is Tim Kaine, unless she thinks she's in political trouble. Then I think you have to go to Elizabeth Warren. I don't think they want to pick a Sherrod Brown or Cory Booker, someone who doesn't really add that much excitement. It's from a state that they'll be replaced by a Republican. At least in Massachusetts, you have a special election a couple months later.
Al, you've been writing a lot of columns lately, and I seem to remember one recent one where you took to task some of these Sanders supporters who are trying to sink Tim Kaine. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can say there's a better choice than Tim Kaine. The 2 criteria ought to be, number 1, can the person be president? And number 2, is the president comfortable with them both in a campaign sense and also particularly in governing? And Tim Kaine clearly meets those tests. She may decide someone's better, but to say that Tim Kaine is out of bounds, that this is a guy who has a 90% ADA voting record, has been a committed liberal by Virginia standards, certainly, and even by national standards, that he's unacceptable, I think would really, you know, create a crazy caucus within the Democratic Party, which was what we used to see some years ago, John.
All right, Al Hunt, thank you for being with us twice on this show today. It's always a pleasure. Up next,
thank you.
What to expect from Donald Trump's North Carolina rally tonight. Mark will talk about that when we come back.
welcome back to Raleigh. We're at the Duke Energy Center for the Performing Arts here, waiting for Donald Trump to arrive for his first public event since James Comey spoke about Hillary Clinton. He's going to appear today with a special guest. Joining me here to talk about the special guest and Donald
Another special guest.
Another special guest, NBC's Katie Tur. So Senator Corker, who we think has been on the list for a while, will be here today. Tomorrow in Ohio, he's going to be campaigning with Newt Gingrich. What's going on with these seeming auditions?
You know, these are very public tryouts. It's almost a version of a tryout on a national stage. I'm sorry, it's so loud in here. But so Donald Trump is trying to test out not only how he interacts with these potential VPs, but how the public takes them. You're going to see Bob Corker here today. How does the crowd react to Bob Corker? Are they as enthusiastic and as excited as they are for him as they are for Donald Trump? Also, Newt Gingrich. Is the crowd as excited for Newt Gingrich? We should probably get a stick mic.
Yeah, keep talking.
Is the crowd as excited for Newt Gingrich as they are for Donald Trump? And I think Newt Gingrich is able to whip up a crowd in many of the same ways Donald Trump is. Bob Corker, we're going to have to see. Governor Pence, we're going to have to see if he gets out on the campaign trail with him. But this is also unprecedented. Usually these are very, circle the wagons, closed-door meetings, whispers. You don't hear about these things under normal circumstances.
What's interesting is that Trump is a great performer. He knows how to get a great reaction from the crowd. I bet you he watches exactly what you said, which is when they speak, do they move the crowd? Do they move the needle? Because that's been such an important part of how he's been a candidate.
Yeah, and I think that looking at this from a political vantage point, who's going to help you in Rust Belt states, or who's going to help you with a certain demographic, I'm not sure that's the correct way to look at things with Donald Trump. He's obviously defied all expectations. I think what we should be looking at is more personality-based. Does he fit with Donald Trump's personality? Does the character match? And also, is he somebody that's going to play the role that Donald Trump wants him to play if they get into the White House? And what I've been hearing is that Donald Trump might ultimately want more of an Ed McMahon than, say, a Joe Biden or a Dick Cheney.
Beyond the tweets Trump put out in reaction to the Comey announcement, there was a lot of press releases, a couple of big long press releases. You've read through them. What's kind of the message there from Trump campaign?
Rigged system. That's the narrative that they've been trying to paint in this campaign now the entire time, but they've really started focusing in on it in the past couple months, saying that not only was it hard for him to get the nomination because it's a rigged system, and that kind of inoculates them from the idea of the delegates taking the nomination away from him at the convention, but also
John, we're going to throw it back to you because they're doing the pledge here.
Okay. Katie Tur, thank you for being with us. Thank you, Mark, for being with us, and we will be right back. One more thing before we go. We couldn't help noticing President Obama's many faces while he was sitting behind Hillary Clinton on stage at that rally here in Charlotte. I was kind of amazed by them. So in case you missed it, don't worry. We've cataloged some of the presidential facial expressions on display. Man, I love those things when we do them. That was kind of fantastic. All right, Mark, I want to come back to the big news of the day. Comey, nobody expected it. Nobody in Clinton world even expected it today. What's your view about its impact and what happens now in the aftermath?
Well, what Comey did was extraordinarily, and I understand why he did it. He felt, given the public scrutiny, particularly in light of what Loretta Lynch did in meeting with Bill Clinton, he needed to have some transparency. But it is an extraordinary step for an FBI director to lay out the facts of a case like that and then exonerate her. I know why he did it, but some people are questioning that, and I think he's now going to have to explain more, and I think people will dig into some of the things he revealed. He revealed some new things today about Hillary Clinton's email practices that either weren't known at all or weren't confirmed. But in the main, not being indicted is obviously a huge political thing for her, but also I think in a weird way, Comey laying it out, saying, I'm a man of integrity, I know all these facts, and yet I still didn't want to indict her. In a weird way, I think that helps her in some ways, and if they get a few breaks, I think this thing may be behind her, and Republicans are going to have to look elsewhere.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that the people, again, from the Clinton officials I talked to today here in Charlotte, they see it that way. They actually, they obviously their first thing was, we're not indicted. That's great. And the second thing was, having Comey take her to the woodshed. Of course, it gives some Republicans some ammunition to fire at her, but it does raise Comey up in some ways and gives them, they can say, look, Comey didn't go easy on us. He didn't go light on us. He didn't seem like he was in any way unwilling to recommend an indictment, but he still didn't indict. And so it speaks well to his integrity.
And if he had just done what would normally be done, which is not say anything, and just let Clinton's lawyers say she's not indicted, people would have wondered, what did they look at? Was there political influence? How did it happen? What standards did he use? Comey laid it out. I think it's unprecedented, certainly within the context of a presidential campaign. And I think in the end, again, with a few breaks, this could help her more than some of the alternatives, although it is still a scathing indictment of how she conducted herself.
As you know, the Clintons don't mind. The Clintons always think they can survive scathing. What they can't survive is indictment. And so they'll take scathing any day of the week. All right. Mark, I'm going to really look forward to hearing what you have to say about what happens down there in Raleigh when we next see each other. Until then, all of our viewers, everybody, Tim Jones has a great story on BloombergPolitics.com right now. It's about a town in Vermont that's debating whether to allow Syrian refugees to resettle there. Coming up this week, we'll be covering Clinton's campaign stop in Atlantic City. Tomorrow, I will be there. Mark will be in Cincinnati with Donald Trump. After that, Joe will do Joe Biden's debut on the campaign trail on Friday in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Coming up on Bloomberg West, the manager of Lockheed Martin's Juno program. Until tomorrow, from me in Charlotte and Mark in Raleigh, we say to you, sayonara.